You're probably familiar with the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Scholars believe it was about 15,000, but I believe it might even been closer to 20,000 people that were fed on 5 loaves and 2 fish. Has anybody here ever felt misunderstood? Or you misunderstood someone else? They tell you something or they're talking to you, and you look at them and you give them one of these? See, I think at this core of this story, it's a story of misunderstanding. The disciples had just come back from a missions trip. And this is the first time the disciples have ever gone on a missions trip without Jesus. They just returned from their long journey, and they're pumped. They're pumped to tell the story, and they're so excited to share it all. But what happens? As soon as they begin sharing everything that's going on, the crowd shows up. The disciples go to Jesus and say, "Yo, Jesus, hey man, it's been like a long day. It's getting dark, Jesus. Like, send the people away. We care about the people, man. It's getting dark out here." The real thing that the disciples were doing, they didn't care about the people. They cared about themselves because they wanted alone time with Jesus. And so what does Jesus do? In verse 3, he says, "You feed them. You feed them." And it says the disciples responded with what? We just got back from a trip that you told us to not take anything, dog. We don't have food, bread, bag, or belt to feed these people. What do you mean you feed them? With what? And then he responds with, "How much bread do you have?" And you know at this point that Peter, again, liberty license, right? We just kind of have to understand. He's the only dude that chopped the dude's ear off, right? So I think he had some anger problems. He probably looked at Jesus and was ready to fight. Because he says, "You feed them." And he's like, "With what?" And he's like, "How much bread do you have?" He's like, "None." Like, what do you mean? How much bread do you have? Again, I think this is a story of misunderstanding. I think that Jesus was talking about the bread of life, the bread that he offers. Yet, see, I think there's times that we're the same way, family. And I believe tonight, God is telling some of you in here tonight, you feed them. You feed them. The real problem that the church sees today is the same problem the disciples had, and that problem is compassion. See, while Jesus had compassion on the crowds, the disciples were annoyed with the crowd. The disciples are trying to send them away to go get a burger so they can spend time with God. How often do we do the same thing, family? We're too caught up in ourselves, just as the disciples were. And we get caught up in everything that's going around us, and we get caught up in ourselves that we're missing what God is wanting to do through us today. Listen, God gave us one job. That job was to go into the nations and make disciples of all nations. That's the job God gave us. And how many times are we caught up in how much money we can make when God is telling you today, you feed them. You feed them.